Hello friends, welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, in philosophy, we will be continuing our discussion on problem of personal identity. It will be lecture number 2 on the problem of personal identity. In this lecture, we will continue with our discussion on the crisis of identity on the basis of body, soul and mind. And we will be continuing with the critique of a soul aspect of personal identity. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Verma is Associate Professor in Department in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thanks, Amrit. Hello viewers, as you're already aware, we have been discussing in our last lecture. We discussed about the problem of identity. We tried to study in the broad contours of what the problem is when we talk about the problem of identity. What exactly is the issue that we are dealing with? What exactly is the problem that we are talking about? We tried to take a historical, kind of a look into it. We saw how sort of the problem, basically, the basic idea behind the problem is that when we're talking about personal identity, which means my identity as a person, which defines me, which defines who I am. And we also talked about why this question is important. This question is important apart from other things, also from also for some of the sort of soteriological reasons. Several philosophies in the past, whether we talk about Greek philosophy, whether we talk about Indian philosophy, emphasizes upon knowing oneself, knowing the real nature of the self. And that's supposed to be one of the core ideas, as a matter of fact. When we look into history of ideas, this is one of the core issues that most the classical philosophies have been dealing with. So emphasis upon knowing oneself. But then the next question, whenever you talk about knowing oneself, knowing thyself as know thyself as it reads on the Temple of Apollo in Greece, is one of the sort of core issues that's defined philosophy, that's defined in the main search in philosophy for a long time. So, but when talk about knowing oneself, what kind of knowledge of the self we are talking about? And before that, as a matter of fact, even before we talk about knowledge of the self, we'll also have to talk about how we define what kind of idea of the self we are working with. So, depending upon our definition, depending upon how we view the very idea of the self, any talk about knowing oneself would start taking shape accordingly. Would start taking taking a path, in accordance with the kind of idea of self that we have. But when we talk about self and identity, self and personal identity, these sort of just identities is a very different notion. Personal identities is more of a metaphysical notion. So we'll have to sort of understand the difference between the two. Identity of a person can be defined from several perspectives. Say, for example, what makes me human is the fact that I belong to. Roughly sort of Homo sapiens, and like certain characteristics that are associated with human beings. I have them. So, but the idea, the idea that we talk about when we talk about in personal identity is what is most definitive of me. What is most sort of peculiar about me. What when I last, what is it that lasts with me? What kind of puts me together into one single unit from my birth until sort of somebody dies. So what is it that sort of brings all these pieces together and binds them into some kind of single unity? something that persists all through our lives and makes us who we are, because that's the only sort of persisting thing. So we talked about in our earlier lecture also how the rationalist idea of identity is a little different from empirical idea, because when we talk about identity strictly in terms of logic, then according to sort of Leibniz, any two things having exactly the same set of qualities is what would account for the identity of the person. But as we saw, this definition may sound a little too strict for us, because there is absolutely nothing, as it seems to us, which stays with us all along. Our body changes, and we saw that one of the best candidates for the purpose of defining our identity is to form the basis of our personal identity is the idea of body. But then we saw that the idea of body is deficient on several counts, because we try to understand the problem from the point of view of the example given by Plutarch, and from some sort of other perspectives as well. There is nothing in our body which stays as it is. Almost everything sort of changes during the lifespan. So there's nothing, as far as in the physical aspect of us is concerned, there's nothing that persists. So one of the idea that strongly presents itself to us is that in that case like body shouldn't be on the one hand, body seems to be the most likely candidate for defining a personal identity, but for the fact that there is nothing that lasts, makes it a very sort of weak proposition for to form the basis of defining our personal identity. So, but we still want to believe that something is there which probably should last. And the idea of soul was one such idea, which we thought would persist after we are not there, we are not there in terms of our body. Because body, as we know, undergoes a lot of change as we age, and also vanishes. But we want to believe, say for example, especially for religious reasons. I mean, in Christianity, there is also this idea of resurrection of the body. So on the day of judgment, there is this resurrection, and some kind of judgment based upon how sort of we carried on our lives on earth. Based on that, some judgment is kind of pronounced upon us. So, but there the problem is that it doesn't come across as a good idea, because a body may not last. I mean, there could be cases where body could be just no more. So in the wake of that, for a long time, the metaphysical idea of soul formed the main criteria of of us talking about our personal identities. So now the next good candidate, we saw what were the problems with body as forming the main basis of personal identity. Next good candidate that we come across is soul. Now, what is soul? If we look at Descartes, according to him, soul is something that's indivisible. And the main sort of characteristic that it has, and which differentiates it from body, is that whereas body is divisible, soul is not. If we talk about the indivisibility of soul, then also another fact comes into the picture. Given the indivisibility, could soul also have in that case certain so to speak particularities, because in a certain way, if something doesn't have parts, then sort of talking about particularities also becomes problematic about it. There has to be something distinctive about soul, because soul is not only the basis. Personal identity is not only the basis to define what persists through us, but also it is very important for the principle of individuation. So, I am a different human being, as compared to several others. So, I have my own peculiarities, I have my own peculiar ways of behaving, and, I carry a different history, which is a part of me, which is in a certain way a part of my consciousness. Certain later hermeneuticists, called it effective historical consciousness, which is always operative according to them whenever we are trying to understand a particular situation, a particular text, and so on and so forth. So there's a historicality that a person comes along. But if soul is without any parts, then it's very difficult to talk about soul in certain it's difficult to talk about soul as having peculiarities of its own, and in that sense it will be very difficult to derive some notion of individuation on the basis of soul alone. So, soul, the idea of soul as forming, the basis of personal identity is a little problematic. And furthermore, as we discussed about it earlier, when we talk about personal identity, what we are looking for, I mean, when we're talking about problem of personal identity, two main things that we are looking for are sufficient conditions and necessary conditions. Necessary condition and sufficient conditions are two different, different kind of demands to be met, because there may be more than one necessary condition for a thing to sufficiently account for something. So and sufficiency is a different kind of criteria. What looks like good enough to form the criteria of something to form the basis of our personal identity. So now the problem is that whenever we are talking about something, if we want to define the sufficiency and necessary, sufficient and necessary conditions in terms of the physical body, then the problem is the vagueness of things. So most of the time, we whatever identity criteria we may hit upon, there may be certain kind of vagueness associated with it. Say, for example, if we were to talk about say, for example, table. We don't know what will be a paradigm case of table. What would be a perfect table, so to speak. So earliest thinkers believed, well, there's a particular sort of form of table with capital F, ethos, and ethos in Greek, which since resides in which because a particular thing participates in that form, it comes to be the thing that it is. So it becomes something defining about its identity. But all of these are imperfect copies, as Plato says. So being imperfect copies, there would be a lot of vagueness about it. So there would be hardly any absolute sort of definition of what it means for something to be a table. As a matter of fact, we can sort of take it further. There's something called the problem of vague predicates. So there, something that sort of like among and there are some paradoxes based on that, and one of the paradoxes based on that is paradox of heap. So it's very difficult to define what what accounts for something to be a heap. Say, for example, if we were to talk of heap of, say, for example, wheat grains, then, what could there be a strict definition of it? Say, for example, if I have 10 grains of wheat and, I put them one over the other, would it count as heap? Then if I take one of them away, would it still be heap? And so on and so forth. So at some point of time, we'll have to say, well, no, it's not heap anymore. So, but the problem here is that could we really define such abstract entities, in such numerical fashion, in such strict fashion? Probably not. And this is also something that some of the Buddhist philosophers take as their central point. So, say, for example, if you look at Nyaya philosophy, sort of according to Nyaya philosophy, things are what they are because they have the universal of that. So, a table is a table because it has the universal, or the Sanskrit term for that is samanya. It has the universal tableness in it. It actually is there, and it is visible. You see it. So the tableness is what makes it a table. But then, Buddhists think that tableness, this idea of tableness, is a figment of imagination. And then Shunyavadins, their characteristic way of arguing against such notions is they would say, well, if table is a table because of some universal residing in it, then they would want to know where exactly does it reside. So the characteristic way, just like the example of the heap that we just saw, I mean, it might seem that concepts like heap, say for example, there is a similar paradox of baldness. A person with just one hair is surely bald, but then if we add one more hair through implant, nowadays implants are possible. So if we add one more hair, would that person be not bald? He would still be bald. We can keep adding, hair, and it's difficult to say at what particular point which nth number of hair would, qualify him. Would make him recover from his baldness. It's a difficult question. But then it might seem to us, well, there are certain cases which count as vague predicates. But if we can push the idea further, as done by the Shunyavadin philosophers, so we could say not only such ideas like heap and baldness and so on and so forth, but even ordinary entities like tables and chairs. So, a characteristic way of arguing, by a Shunyavadin philosopher would go somewhat like this. So, Shunyavadin would sort of maybe break the table apart and, would sort of take one leg apart and say, well, is it still the table? We are likely to say yes, and probably he would break yet another leg of the table. We would probably say yes, but probably after all legs are removed, we would say, well, probably it's no more a table. But then the point is, does that mean that actually the universal of tableness resides in the fourth leg? Because it is only after that we say that it's no more a table. Or if somebody insists, well, it's still a table without any legs, then a similar kind of thing could be done on the tabletop as well. At some point of time, we'll have to say, well, it has ceased to be a table now. And that would mean the last broken part is what accounted for the tableness in the thing, which is again a very absurd conclusion. So the idea here is that, the idea of body would always remain problematic, not only on account of the problem that we saw, when we took up the analogy of ship of Theseus, because we are in perpetual change, cells are, we are a functional unity, but each part of us, is under constant rejuvenation, is replaced by newer parts. We always form new cells, we discard old cells, and so on and so forth. So like we have a functional unity. What would Locke call, we partake of the same life. We are an organization of matter, of tissues, of cells, which partake of the same life, so that organizational unity stays throughout with us. But we cannot be very strict in physical terms. We cannot say, well, say for example, if we talk about one particular particle, we can be sure, well, this particle, if it persists from time 1 to time t2, it is the same particle. But particle is is the smallest unit. I mean, we're using the term particle here in the smallest unit. So therefore, it has to be strictly the same. If we're talking about atoms, just one single electron would change it entirely. So there we'll have to talk about very strict unity. Nothing can go away, nothing can be added, because it'll simply create a new element altogether with an entirely different set of properties. But if it is applicable for one particle, it should be also applicable for something that's constituted of number of particles. But something that is true at micro level, the same strict criteria, we cannot hold at a macro level, because then it becomes hugely problematic. There is nothing same, and yet the functional unity, in a certain sense, remains same throughout. So the problem here is, any physical basis of defining personal identity. Here, in the case of personal identity among human beings, it'll be the case of body. Then the problem is, the problem of vagueness would also come into the picture. Apart from the fact that body is being there are newer parts replacing older parts, and so on and so forth. So apart from that, this problem is also there, because we would never know, there's certain vagueness. Say for example, we came to know from the point from the example of the tableness of thing. So we really don't know which part when broken would take the tableness away, because that will be they'll impact upon what is the necessary and sufficient conditions. If we have a strict definition of what counts as a table, which is difficult, we cannot say a table is something that stands on 4 tables. Well, something can stand on just three legs alone. We cannot say, well, table has to be always rectangular. It could be round in shape. So there can be no sort of strict way of defining it, and also not only that, this part and whole problem is also going to remain. That being the case, it's very difficult to formulate a set of necessary conditions which would be sufficient to form the basis of identity of something, and in present case, the personal identity of something. So in any physical scenario, this problem is always going to stay. So depending on that, given that fact, it looks very tempting to us that probably soul is soul looks like a good candidate for it. And as a matter of fact, in early Greek, in Greek philosophy as well, say for example, Plato thought soul is something different from the body, and soul, he believed could transmigrate as well. He thought that body almost as if bogs the soul down, because body has its own instincts, which sort of add weight to the soul, and the soul, the wings of the soul disappear. But there could be a way, and sort of through what he calls love and so on, we could get those wings again. These are the ideas he talks about in his dialogue named Phaedrus. And sort of we could overcome the limitations put upon us by body, and we could our souls could get back their wings and sort of and go. So he thinks of soul as a separate thing. The only difference that we see in Aristotle is that he thinks that soul and body are kind of inseparable. So soul is the form of the body. So in a certain sense, even though soul is what defines the telos of the body, but it is something that is internal to it, and then this is what gives a thing some kind of intrinsic thrust, some internal thrust towards a particular goal to be achieved. So the idea of soul and idea of soul as something that is more definitive of us, because the rest would keep changing, our body would keep changing, and its drives would keep changing. So the idea of soul for a long time it was believed is more definitive of us. So the idea there is that if we have the same soul, we are the same person. So now soul, the idea of soul, the metaphysical of notion of soul, and sort of combined with soul as the basis of personal identity, together makes it possible to believe that somebody could survive after death. So for those religious reasons, and mainly for religious purposes, the idea of soul appears as a strong candidate, and in that case also it appears to us. I mean, this idea was taken very seriously, and body in that case seems to become an instrument in the hands of soul. So such that body is something which helps soul to achieve certain purposes, to instrumentally be able to perform certain functions. So we will talk about this dichotomy a little more about this dichotomy. We'll return after a short break.
Dear friends, so far in this session we have discussed about criticism of soul as the basis of personal identity. On that note, we will take a break, and after the break we will resume our session on philosophy. Thank you for watching. Hello friends, welcome to this session of the problem of personal identity part 2 lecture. In this lecture, we will continue with our discussion on the soul as the basis of personal identity, as well as Locke on Locke's view on personal identity. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert Dr. Ajay Verma. We will ask Dr. Verma to resume his discussion on this lecture.
Thank you, Amrit. Yeah, so hello viewers. We were talking about we saw how body, or for that matter, not only body, any criteria, any physical criteria, and it's only when we talk about physical criteria, that we could talk about parts and whole. And whenever we talk about part and whole, the problem of sufficiency conditions and necessary conditions takes a whole new different turn. And as we saw, that sort of the problem there is that there cannot be any strict criteria, because if we follow the criteria in mathematical terms, the way Leibniz has formulated it, then it's almost impossible to meet that criteria. And especially if we want to talk about sort of strict unity, strict identity in the physical sense, it's absolutely sort of it's very sort of at micro level maybe we could talk about it. But since we are a complex human being, so personal identity sort of becomes a hugely problematic issue. It's just very difficult to follow that criteria very strictly in numerical terms. In numerical terms, having exactly the same part and persisting in time with exactly the same set of parts is something that's impossible, because of sort of the vagueness that we talk about, where we talked about. And so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, the sort of different theories of causation, could also be examined from that aspect. Say, for example, in Indian philosophy, we have this debate between Satkaryavad and Asatkaryavad, where in Satkaryavad, sort of the idea is that since the content, the main substance is same, so basically there is nothing new ever coming into existence as a fact. These are mere modifications. Example often cited is gold and clay. So it's the same clay. We could give it different shapes, but it's the same clay. So that being the case, sort of the identity of something, should be formed on the should be sort of defined on the basis of its content, so to speak, what it is made of. That remains the same throughout. So nothing new ever is born. So that way, sort of the principle of individuation takes a back seat here. So individuation is mere sort of a modification of things, which doesn't seem to account for much. Whereas in a Satkaryavad, like each time something new is formed. So there is sort of sufficient and necessary conditions. When they are met, something becomes the cause of some effect that comes into the picture, and that effect is something new that was earlier not there. So under Asatkaryavad, Asatkaryavad is more robust view, is more conducive to have some sort of robust notion of identity, because and also sort of gives us a stronger basis for to talk about individuation of things, whereas if we talk about something immaterial, because the general idea about soul is that it's some kind of immaterial substance which defines us, and on Descartes' account, it's not only immaterial substance, it's also without parts, so something that's not material. Also, we don't know how to talk about its parts. But the problem, Locke is not happy. Locke, as we have already sort of talked about it, Locke is one of the main proponents who, who in a certain way, in most systematic fashion, raises this problem for the first time. Just like sort of the beginning of mind body problem is generally associated with Descartes, though sort of it's not that sort of earlier philosophers not talking about this duality, but it was in the most systematic way. It was first formulated by Descartes, and then there's been this whole debate, and then sort of going on into philosophy of mind, and sort of there are further and further sort of takes on the issue that we come across every now and then. So similarly, Locke was probably the first philosopher who systematically sort of formulated it as a philosophical problem. Now, Locke, takes up both these alternatives, as we saw. The three main alternatives that we have when we talk about, personal identity. So, three main alternatives are body, soul, and mind, or consciousness. So now the next candidate, soul. We saw some of the problems that are there, but in addition to that, another important charge, and the reason why Locke doesn't think of soul as a good candidate to form the basis of our personal identity, is that we can, since souls, we cannot talk about qualitative difference among between souls. So any soul is as good. I mean, it's only an embodied soul that may or that may have certain that may get certain characteristics associated with, in virtue of the kind of embodiment it has. But apart from the body, we cannot talk about how one soul would be different from another, especially given the fact that it's immaterial. So, that being the case, I can never be sure that I'm the same soul. Say, for example, the example that is often cited is that, say, for example, when I sleep, I'm not even aware of my body. And suppose, like, while I was sleeping, a different soul enters into my body, while the earlier one goes away. And since sort of my consciousness and the memory imprints and my body, everything else is same, except that the soul is different. And since the soul is immaterial, we don't know how to talk about the differences between two souls. So everything about me would be same, except that probably it's a different soul that I'm carrying. But there is no way of ascertaining it, because soul is not an empirical thing. And since it's not empirical, it's not material, we don't know how to differentiate between the two souls, and for that reason, maybe if somebody says, well, sort of I'm changing soul, sort of say souls are being changed each day. There seems to be hardly a counter argument to that. So even if probably the sort of this refutation doesn't say that, well, soul therefore doesn't exist. The idea here is that even if soul were to exist, the criteria of soul as forming the basis of forming the basis of personal identity looks too feeble, because if it is immaterial, then we don't know. Maybe sort of each day we are different human beings. Each day maybe sort of our soul is being replaced by other, and since soul cannot be the seat of anything, therefore, and there could be nothing abiding in the soul, therefore even if the soul is changed, we for all practical purposes we don't know. And if we believe that that soul has sort of could be something that could have qualities, then it raises a whole set of different issues. Then it cannot be it cannot be sort of without parts. It cannot be in immaterial substance. Then we'll have to define it in some new way, because if you look at some old ideas, even in the soul, the person remains, so to speak, the same. There, what happens is, the problem then in that case would be if soul transmigrates into a different body, would the body change? I mean, would the behavior, everything, would that change? So, does soul have dispositions? It seems very unlikely. And this is what differentiates the idea of mind from the idea of soul. So soul, therefore, for the reasons we just cited, soul does not look like a good criteria to form the basis of identity. And also, apart from that, I mean, one last criticism that could be placed against the idea of soul is probably, since soul does not have a precept. Kant, very famously said that to form a judgment we require both precepts and concepts. So precepts, without concepts would be kind of blind. So in that case, unless we have both the things, precepts and concepts, we cannot have a good, robust judgment about things. And given that, if we take that to be the case, in that case we know that there is no precept corresponding to soul. Soul is something that we that we the idea that we form on on the basis of just some kind of a conceptual jugglery, and something that is without a concept could lead to any kind of argument into any direction, something that he calls paralogisms. So with concepts alone we can build up any kind of arguments in whatever direction, and we may want to prove whatever that we want to. So that way, the idea of soul, from that point of view as well, is not really a very good sustainable idea to account for what we call our personal identity. So in that case, then what is it that abides in us? Now Locke has a very interesting take on the issue. First of all, he says, well, there on one hand we have plants and animals, and they seem to have some kind of a unity that runs through their entire lifetime. And that could be viewed on the basis of some kind of organizational unity that they have. As a matter of fact, in this context, he says, and I'm quoting from him, he says this about animals and plants. He says, in case of animals and plants, organization of parts in one coherent body partaking of one common life, continuous history of, so they form a kind of continuous history of such an organized form, so such an organized life. So plants and animals are organization of parts which form one coherent body which partakes of one common life, and there is continuous history of such organized life. And this is how, in terms of which we can, talk about some kind of something that abides in plants and animals. But there's something else which makes us, we are not only organisms, we are not only biological organisms like plants and animals. We have something additional to them, Locke believes, which is consciousness. And this consciousness is something that we that is something essential to be able to state that I know this. So in that sense, consciousness is also the seat of memory. That I sort of not only know that this is something happened, but I also know that this is something what I did. So this consciousness and an inbuilt notion of some kind of something that's persisting within consciousness, namely memory. These are the two things which could be sort of main fundamental sort of principles which could on the basis of which we could define our identities. So according to him, actually he has a forensic view, what is called forensic notion of self, or of personal identity. So for him, the notion of identity, say for example, like somebody could say, well, why do we require a notion of identity altogether? If there is nothing abiding in us, in terms of our body, soul is not a good criteria, then we may better give it up. But for Locke, it is necessary, to sort of to define, to have a proper definition for what accounts for personal identity, for forensic reasons, because responsibility, sort of requires owning of certain actions, just taking responsibility for actions, requires us to have a robust notion of identity. He tries to explain this to us, through a certain example. He says, suppose there is a pauper, there's a beggar, and there is a prince, and suppose there is some kind of an exchange of sort of consciousness between the two. Now sort of the consciousness along with the memories that were there in Prince, kind of migrates into the body of the pauper. So now when the pauper wakes up, he would expect people to behave, in front of him as if he were the prince. Whereas, as a matter of fact, that is not the case. Whereas, the consciousness of pauper and along with the memory has migrated into the body of the prince, and in virtue of that, probably prince would rather go to may sort of by reflex would start seeking alms from everybody around him, and he would be happy to be in a palace if at all. But there he would be happy because he would have people around him, probably the rich people around him, who would give him more alms. So in that case, to hold somebody responsible for something, say for example, if there was some crime committed by the prince, then who is to be held responsible? The person who remembers having committed it. So it has to be the person who is inside the body of the pauper, of the beggar, because that is the person who remembers doing it. So for him, memory is an important criteria. As a matter of fact, for him, if somebody commits a crime, somebody commits an action, somebody does something, and later on forgets it, actually forgets it, then on Locke's account, from forensic point of view, that person cannot be held responsible. Why? Because it's not the same person. What he says is it's the same man, but it's not the same person. So that means a person for him, that person would, even like we would have been we could have reasonably argued that is the same person in case that person remembered actually of having done that that particular action. But if he genuinely doesn't remember doing that, then for all forensic purposes, it's not the same person. It may be the same man, and it's not a man who's culprit. Sort of if we sort of take it to a logical conclusion, but it's a person who commits a crime. It's not a man who commits the crime. It's not somebody's body who, some kind of an organized, biological organism which commits the crime. There is some kind of an intention behind a crime, and we can talk about intention, only in terms of consciousness, and if somebody has actually memory of having done something like that. So, for Locke, it is the memory which which according to him is the best candidate to account for some kind of unity throughout our lifespans. This is what provides us what we call that forms the basis of what we call personal identity. And also, apart from that, and before he starts, he argues for memory as the main basis behind the personal identity. He also refutes, he argues that consciousness cannot have something innate in it. If there was something that we were born with, something that we were born with in our minds, and something that abides all through our lives, then those, and something that is called the innate ideas that we are born with, and we throughout our lives those ideas are operative in our mind. We don't have anything like that. And he presents an elaborate critique of innate ideas, and he proves that there is nothing, universal about any idea. Say, for example, smallness of things, bigness of things. It's all relative. What counts as good, what counts as bad. All these things are relative. Say, for example, during barbarian times, what counted as a good action, didn't count as a good action. Say, for example, doesn't count as a good action in modern times. Killing, was supposed to be an act of valor at one particular time in Roman history. No more today. So that way, that way there is no sort of idea. There are no innate ideas in us which abide throughout our lives. Otherwise, that probably would have been the strongest case that would have been most definitive about us, and that would have been the most robust basis talk about our personal identity. But he refutes that, and he says that whatever we find later on in inside us is basically ideas that we sort of we form empirically on the basis of experience. Therefore, there is nothing which which exists in our mind, which comes into our consciousness independent of experience, something that was always there. So that being the case, memories are also something empirical, it's sort of what I do, and so it's empirical. We experience certain things, certain impressions, are formed inside our consciousness, and those impressions last. Now, the next, having understood, the next problem that that arises is it a foolproof kind of a notion if memory is what gives us some kind of continuity? This is called, the view of of psychological continuity. So, if psychological continuity is what provides us, which forms the basis of our personal identity, is it foolproof? We'll find that it's not foolproof. We find that there could be several problems with it. People, lose memories. There's something called, Venetian memories, or something called quasi-memories. False memories can be sort of put inside a person's becomes consciousness. Also, sort of, we don't always remember, what we did a few days back. So there is no continuity in memory. So there could be a number of objections against this view. So today we talked about, what could be how body and soul don't form, are not good candidates for personal identity. We also saw how Locke overcomes this problem and presents the idea that probably consciousness and memory is something distinctive about us, and how memory and on the basis of that, psychological continuity that we can have with the help of memory, that probably is the best candidate, that is for personal identity. In our next lecture, we'll talk about what are the problems with regard to the notion of personal identity on the basis of psychological continuity, and apart from that, we will also look into Hume's critique of personal identity. So that's all for today. Thank you.
Dear friends, on that note, we would like to thank Dr. Verma for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.